Right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here as we discuss, can the industry afford to comply? My name is Mark Slaugh. I'm the CEO and founder of iComply. We've been a compliance company in the space since 2011, experienced heavily in the world of cannabis business operations for all types of licensed facilities, dealing with standard operating procedures, audits, corporate compliance training, and of course, the ever-changing rules that seem to be plaguing the industry. I'll be hosting today's webinar, and I have with me a team of experts and colleagues in the industry, all sort of focused on different areas of operational compliance, GMP, and other areas of a multitude of different rules and regulations from a multitude of different agencies that, of course, impact the cannabis businesses. So I'll just sort of start from left to right here. If David, you want to give yourself a quick introduction, we'll go ahead and let everybody know who you are.
Sure thing. Hey, everybody. Good to see friendly faces and some new names here. David Vaillencourt. I wear a few different hats. CEO and founder of the GMP Collective, which has been around since 2018, helping companies with advisory services and strategic positioning around standards and best practices to make their businesses have a lower risk tolerance and more operationally consistent. I also am the vice chair of ASTM's Committee D37 on cannabis, developing consensus standards, and also the chairman and co-founder of the S3 Collective, which is a nonprofit, bridging the gap between the research and standards so that ultimately industry operators, consumers can do everything that we all are here to talk about, have consistency and a level playing field for a legitimate and regulated marketplace. So I will pause there.
Thanks, David. Kim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Kimberly Anzarut. I'm the CEO of a company called Allay Consulting. We're an operational compliance consulting firm that mainly deals with state regulations, GMP certification, GACP certification, and OSHA. So we've been in the industry since 2017. And yeah, love working with you guys.
Always happy to see you, and I think you guys are always hosting really great events too, which is always lovely when we get to see you in person and your team. So
I'll
anyone
be in
who can,
town in April, so
yeah, I saw.
everybody
So
come.
that'd be great. When she says in town, I think she means Denver because we all are all over the place with as much as goes on in this industry. Darwin, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Mark, for having me. Very much really appreciate it and looking forward to today's webinar. I am the technical director for CSQ, which is Cannabis Safety and Quality, and we're an accredited CGMP certification program for cannabinoid product manufacturers. I'm also the owner and founder of TSOC LLC, and a fellow volunteer member of ASTM International with David and Kim, where I serve as the subcommittee chair for the D3708 on personal use cannabis devices and appliances, as well as the subcommittee vice chair for the D3704 on cannabis processing and handling.
Thanks, and affectionately known as the Spock of cannabis in so many ways. Darwin and I have had the pleasure of working on industry association panels and policy groups as well, and he's the one smart cookies. So appreciate you being here. And Amber, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark, and thanks to everyone for being here today. My name's Amber Loniger. I'm a cannabis attorney and founder of Purple Circle. I started my career at Vicente Cedarburg, now Vicente, back in 2017, and worked there for a couple years, then went to work in-house for Trulieve, one of the larger multi-state cannabis operators. While I was there, I helped manage compliant operations in about 11 or 12 different markets through the largest merger in cannabis history when Trulieve acquired Harvest Health and Recreation. Lots of hands-on experience there. But in 2022, I founded Purple Circle really with the goal of bringing accessible and affordable compliance services to the industry, specifically small businesses, social equity businesses, minority-owned businesses, et cetera. So it's been a really wonderful experience. I'm really glad to be here today with all of these experts. I also do some legal work in the hemp space, and I'm a member of NABCL, the National Association of Black Cannabis Lawyers, amazing group if anybody wants to check them out, and on the board of Women in Cannabis Expo.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I'm really excited to kind of pick your brains today and discuss this important topic. More and more, I think, as we move and navigate through this industry and as time goes on and the cycles of repetitive rules seem to repeat every year, we're starting to notice some trends and patterns in some of these marketplaces. Things like prices sort of dropping because of oversaturation. So my first question is kind of for Kim. In the industry where you're constantly facing this complex and evolving regulatory landscape, can you give us a sense of how this financial strain is impacting cannabis operators and how maybe market prices are impacting compliance-related costs and affecting operators in the space?
Yeah, well, the oversaturation issue has happened in many, many states over and over and over, and because things move so quickly in this space, there's a lot of this up and down, right? And we watch the market kind of, oh, it's getting better, and then it drops out again. It just kind of depends on the state and how things are being ran and how many licenses there are and all of that kind of thing. It also affects, like weather affects a lot of things with the market and things like that. And when it comes to compliance, I think a lot of people don't realize, and I think that this happens in a lot of states, where there isn't a lot of regulatory oversight, where they don't have enough regulators to start going out into places. Or, I have gone into companies that have never been seen by a regulator before, and then all of a sudden, OSHA shows up and they have no idea what to do, right? So this happens a lot where people kind of put compliance on the back burner, because they're like, hey, these guys are not even coming in yet. We haven't even seen a regulator yet, which is a really huge problem because not only does it, put a huge risk for the company if there's an outbreak or there's a recall situation or, a worker safety situation, which is what we deal with mainly, that can really harm the business, right? And if there is a big issue, then regulators from even from a federal level will come in, right? If there's a big outbreak in cannabis or there's a death in cannabis, then OSHA and FDA are going to get involved. And I don't think that people really understand that. And so, when you put compliance on the back burner like that, you actually run into bigger issues down the line, with, having to deal with that because having your, company in a recall situation, or somebody, God forbid, dying, obviously doesn't look great for your company, is going to affect you, on a huge, huge level. So, I think that with the markets, it does kind of put stakeholders in a really tight spot where they're like, hey, we either help, pay for someone to help us with compliance, or we just ignore it because we haven't seen anybody in a while. And eventually that, isn't going to work for everyone, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the rules, getting more complex tends to put right some of these reactions on the plates of regulators. So you've got Canra coming up with their big event, and that's the Association of Regulators will be meeting here in Denver in the next few months. And some of these conversations that are very alive are around health and safety. And we're seeing a record number of health and safety advisories and warnings out of California, Colorado, some of these more established markets where the oversaturation has happened. The prices are sort of in the toilet, and so it gets put on the back burner, I think, to some degree because of affordability. But the mounting pressures are still coming in terms of putting that requirement on operators to be compliant. And to your point, the expense of not paying for that or not managing it appropriately, putting it on the back burner, could be pretty expensive. David, what do you think in terms of some of the bigger compliance costs that certain types of businesses face? You working in sort of GMPs, probably dealing more with manufacturers, but maybe also GACPs and cultivators. What do you see as sort of maybe the larger cost concerns that are part of those mounting pressures?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. And I think about this, building on some of what Kim was saying, and just thinking yourself as a small business owner, which we all are here on the panel, right? It's more than just, hey, I'm going to file with the Secretary of State and file my taxes, and that's all I need to do. Like that's minimum compliance to be a business. But that's not what makes you a successful business, right? It's making sure you've got processes in place. It's differentiating yourself with branding, right? It's going above and beyond show that you are an above board company, that you're making quality, consistent products, whether you're a consulting firm or whether you're a cannabis owner and brand owner. And unfortunately, because of the stigma and the hurdles that has been part of this industry's challenge to become a legally regulated and recognized marketplace, there's additional barriers in place in terms of compliance requirements, and they're very onerous and challenging. And I want to actually speak to one of your points, Mark. One of the topics that was just released for Canada's regulatory external stakeholder event is around areas of overregulation. So as we start to mature because of oversaturation and challenges of just there's no bar, and so it's kind of this falling this race to the bottom in a lot of marketplaces to survive. Where can regulations be removed or relaxed, modified so that everybody has a level playing field and that it's really serving the needs, which is ultimately for consumer protection, right? The government exists to protect us and serve us. And so have we gone, over and above in terms of regulating this marketplace? I think there's a fair reason to say yes in a lot of areas. And what does that look like? We've got to dive into it. But in terms of, answering your question a little bit more directly, there's a few things that come to mind for me that I see all the time. And it's, retrofitting the facilities, poor decisions made. Hey, let's just slop this together, throw some equipment in the room. And then you realize later on you don't have enough electricity, you don't have water plumbed to the right areas, all these little things. You don't have enough areas for employees to change or even break rooms. Like these little things, if you don't think about it ahead of time, becomes a major headache and a major barrier to operation, inefficient, and in many cases not GMP or compliant, not just from a GMP standpoint, but from being able to make a safe and consistent product. And I like to think about the old adage, measure twice, cut once. You think it's expensive to hire somebody, an expensive consultant? Try a cheap one, because then you pay for it two or three times over for years. Like that's the reality. Folks learn the hard way all too often, and I think we have been in the industry. Kim, you mentioned since 2017. We've all been doing this. Mark, you said 2011. We've all been doing this for years now. The amount of knowledge that we've learned and can transfer, it's not like back in the old days when there was nothing to share, right? And we were just kind of going blind. Two other brief things too that I've seen is raw materials. When you look at the limits for, say, pesticides and solvents, they're way stricter. Hershey's candy bar is allowed to have 100 times more pesticides because of the oral ingestion than what a lot of these cannabis products are allowed to have. So you don't realize that maybe your sugar ingredient, not your cannabis ingredient, could be the source of your product failure. So you have to ask these questions, not just say it's from Domino Sugar. Like you actually have to look a little bit closer and test your raw ingredients, which is a critical supplier qualification program that goes into any GMP or quality system. And then finally, part of the challenge to not having consistent SOPs and documented processes and procedures, even down to an onboarding process, is staff turnover. When people are just flowing in and out because they have a lack of consistency and feel like, there's a lack of clarity on what to do, employee turnover is really freaking expensive. The hiring process, onboarding and training just for somebody to leave 3 to 6 months later, God, that is so painful to an operation, can really sink you. So hopefully that's helpful. I'll pause there and turn back to you, Mark.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Darwin, you have your hand up. You have anything to add to what David had to say?
Yeah, well, actually, I was just going to piggyback on both what Kim and David said. Like,
Yeah.
and it seems that, right, these costs of doing business, right, that really they are standard costs that you're going to see in really a lot of different industries. What we're seeing, I think, is a rapid catching up of those costs, right? Those daily operating costs with those shrinking margins. So this is your cost of doing business, but as you were saying before, oversaturation and other factors, right, is making those margins smaller and smaller and smaller. So it starts to really actually hurt, when when you actually still have to pay for all of these various operating costs, right? Especially costs like testing. That was one thing that was mentioned, but in a lot of cases, right, testing is almost like your insurance, because you have to test, and that testing and that data you're relying on for compliance is basically what is giving you your assurances that your product is safe, compliant, right, and ready for sale. Because like as Kim was mentioning, right, with recalls, there are two types of businesses. There are those that have had a recall, and there are those that will. And, being ready for that, right? That's really where it comes down to. These costs are things that you have to be able to be willing to spend on.
Yeah, 100%. I think part of the challenge is where with the industry prices dropping, right? You have your business model out there. You're expecting, let's say, 1,200 a pound or 1,500 a pound, right, from a grow standpoint, and now you're dealing with $300 or $400 pounds. A lot of these expenses that are piled on, right, may not be increasing as much as your price is decreasing, but it lowers those margins to the point where people can't afford to retrofit their facility from 2012, right, or 2014 when they built it with two by fours and didn't have testing standards out there that are such low levels that it's really easy to fail, right? So how do we maybe design better systems or retrofit when we're dealing with costs that are increasing and margins that aren't there? And what we're seeing is people maybe avoiding testing costs, right? Submitting batch samples that aren't representative of the whole batch, or finding other ways to shortcut compliance, which of course can be very dangerous for their business, but also dangerous for consumers. So I guess one of the questions I have for you, Darwin, is, how do you use how do you maybe work within those restraints, right? To use things like technology or to leverage some of these better systems that can maybe help minimize that impact of financial costs of compliance and maybe make more efficient systems. We mentioned kind of turnover costs and some of these other things. We tend to take an approach with compliance, but I want to hear kind of a little bit about the technology side of things, or maybe solutions out there for folks that are struggling to meet compliance costs.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. I think, and probably David and Kim can agree, or hopefully will agree, but good manufacturing practices in general are a great way to lower operating your costs and improve efficiencies within your business. So those margins we were talking about before, GMPs give you much more visibility over your process, which allows you to track down errors more quickly, allows you to spend resources more efficiently. And so really what that does is it starts to improve those day-to-day margins because you actually can operate a little bit more efficiently. And it, in some cases, can even streamline compliance because in a lot of cases, a lot of the requirements for GMPs are also mirrored within your state's requirements. So going that extra level in most cases, because majority of the markets in the United States don't require GMPs to be implemented. But going over you're able to prove that you're putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and you're demonstrating legitimacy and stability for the marketplace there. And there are a lot of great tools nowadays that you can use to make this process, which is going to just improve your general operating efficiencies and give you better margins, that can make that even more efficient with your electronic quality management systems and other tools. I know that Mark, you've got one that's really great that works that you use internally, and there are a bunch of tools now that can be used to, as I said, to kind of speed up the documentation part, the paperwork part of quality management, which I think is a real advantage that license operators can take advantage of now, especially tools like AI and other things when there are repetitive tasks,
Sure.
when you can get those done more quickly with, an automation tool.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's smart systems that can be designed and fairly affordably, right? The technology is kind of out there to help folks manage it, and I think that's really the key difference, right? Getting into a position where you're proactively managing compliance instead of it managing you is kind of key. Amber, you do a lot of work like we do, sort of at iComply, dealing with compliance, risks and helping folks navigate compliance management, right? As a principal. I think our general methodologies and ways of doing that, I always tell people there's a million ways to do cannabis wrong, and there's very few ways to do it right. So what do you see out there, in terms of legal risks, financial risks? What are the costs of non-compliance as it relates to state, federal regulations to some degree? And, are those risks worth, and at what price, right, worth the investment in compliance management or compliance in general?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I think it was hit on earlier, but to me, really, when producing consumable goods, like consumer or patient safety has to be paramount. And of course, we're seeing issues come up in the workplace now. Worker safety as well. And there's some real risks that come along with that. You're seeing some litigation coming out of issues like this currently, and it's definitely important for operators to be aware and really document their systems and be organized. But at the same time, I think it's very easy to spend money in this industry specifically on compliance and maybe not spend it the best way. I always really encourage people to make sure they're working with partners that they can trust, to identify when an attorney is needed versus when a consultant might be able to help you. So important, always looking at that benefit risk analysis, of course, and making good business decisions. But I've found there's a lot of ancillary companies out there looking to serve this industry, and as a licensee and an operator, like, you really have to be careful in choosing who you work with. And just kind of circling back to a couple of things, we talked, I think, a little bit about saturation. And of course, there are some states, experiencing what some would call saturation. I don't know that anyone has worked out the perfect licensing system yet, but in my mind, just the language we use in that regard, we should, be a little careful about, really ensuring that there's equal opportunity for everyone to have a real opportunity in this space. The opposite of saturation in many cases is limited licensing, which we've seen go awry in almost every market that it has been implemented in. So, I don't know that there's a good middle ground approach that we've seen yet, maybe zoning, setbacks. I know New Mexico is navigating this issue right now, and there are a lot of people calling for licenses to be closed, but the regulators there already have mechanisms in place in the regulations to do other things to address that alleged saturation. So, we just want to be a little careful there. And I think, again, GMP's, fantastic idea, adhering to those standards and going above and beyond those regulations. Of course, it's expensive just to comply, but to the extent that we can. But when GMP certification is required, like, that does add another layer of costs and activities that the business will have to complete. And it's not small. It's not something to sneeze at. So I'm just always really careful with this stuff. And I can't count the number of times that I've talked myself out of work because after talking with a potential client, it's clear that they don't really need a compliance professional. We heard about quality management systems, and when you really break that down, it's a good organized foldering system, it's a good organized calendar system, it's a good organized record keeping system, change management system, and all of that can be implemented in Microsoft and Asana, which is a free service, and it's an excellent one that I use on a daily basis. So just being really real about trying to keep some of these costs down for folks who I know are really struggling and are not getting usual tax deductions. They're not getting traditional access to banking and funding. They're paying a lot already just to survive. Where I kind of prefer to focus is like reducing those regulatory barriers, right? While still prioritizing patient, consumer, worker safety, of course. But I think I saw even just recently that Illinois is switching to the metric system for seed to sale tracking. And they are going to be, I think, the first state where the tags are free. And can you imagine the capital that would, free up for the traditional cannabis cultivator? Really looking at the regulations that we have, are they intended to protect patient and consumer safety, or are they intended to maintain control over an industry? And really looking at things through these lenses, showing up to your rulemaking and legislative meetings, as difficult as that is, I know, it's a really, really important part of this process.
Extremely important. I always say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we just did a deregulation bill, last year in Colorado to reduce some costs because the industry has a collective voice and is speaking up through your trade associations to be able to tell regulators and lawmakers that the burdens are too much, right? That their business can't survive if they're required to jump through all these hoops and to pay for all these extreme costs. I do think it's interesting to see some of the changes, in terms of enforcement, kind of going away from this infraction, violation, and violation affecting public safety that we saw in Colorado to just now a two-tiered system, right? You're either able to get a slap on the wrist or you're not, and there's no assurances of voluntary compliance anymore, that sort of thing in states like Colorado. So it's interesting to see the regulators also, sort of, I always call it the kumbaya period when a new state opens and everybody's friends, right? You're friends with the regulator until you're not, and they draw that line. But it's going to be really interesting, I think, to kind of see how regulators manage this also, because the more businesses that drop out, the less people are paying in licensing fees to support the number of regulators needed to effectively regulate an industry. So it's, back to kind of the point on some of the market dynamics that Kim was talking about. I call it kind of the pillars of economic viability. If you don't, build these markets in an intelligent way, and I'm not even sure if it's number of licenses, because number of licenses is a vague statement. Is that 1,000 plants each, or 10,000 square feet each? There's a production capacity component that really is going to determine how much product is provided in a marketplace. Because we've also seen, too many licenses go awry in places like Oklahoma, where then again, you don't control production capacity. You can't control 10,000 cannabis licenses because everybody got one under their seat or in a Cracker Jack box, like it was the Oprah Winfrey show. So there's definitely a careful balance with that. And I think that does take, definitely involving yourself in the political process and in the regulatory process. We're not really in the cannabis business. I say it all the time. We're in a legal and compliance business, and then you can grow and buy and sell cannabis. Kim, just as a follow-up, what are some of the best practices that you think that the industry should be looking at, to Amber's point, with the level of affordability in mind, to be able to manage those risks and mitigate some of those costs?
Yeah, so I mean, the things, obviously there's like 1,000 things that has to be in place for GMP if we're talking about GMP or, especially state regulations. I think that David touched on this, but building the facility correctly from the beginning, I can't even tell you, we do floor plan reviews, and it's, one of our baseline one-time things that we do for people who are building, either retrofitting a facility or building it out. It's one of our biggest money savers for people, because we can just take a look at the floor plan and say, this is where your hand sinks need to be. These are where your floor drains need to be. This is what the walls, floors, and ceilings need to be made of. And then they just share that with our contractor, and it will save them hundreds of thousands of dollars down the line, because I can't even tell you how many times people will come to us and say, our GMP certifying body, like what Darwin works for, said that this is wrong and this is wrong, right? But our contractor said that it was GMP, but the contractors don't know what GMP is. And so
Right.
it's really, that is really, really defeating for people. They're like, we have to rip the whole floor out and redo plumbing, and that's going to cost us $50,000 to $100,000. And that right there makes GMP very expensive, right?
Yeah, let
The other
alone
thing,
retrofitting, where you have to shut down your operations just to try to redo your plumbing, right? Or your flooring.
right. Yeah,
It's
and it's a
wow.
nightmare. It's a nightmare for people that are like, I'm making money. I have this really great brand. We're doing great. And then all of a sudden, oh, wait, we can't get GMP. And sometimes, states decide, I think, it's a trend, right? Darwin just put in the comments that, New York, Florida, Maryland, more and more states are starting to decide to do this because of the lack of regulation, or like the lack of regulators, right? If you require GMP from an accredited third party, then they need less regulators going in, right? The risk is mitigated.
Well, you don't have to
Um,
teach the cops how to look at GMP, right? Which is
right,
not necessarily
exactly,
their
which
skill
is
set, right?
very hard. Yeah. So, having the facility itself, to GMP standards from the get-go, is always, a huge mitigation of spending a lot of money. And then on top of that is just like knowing what needs to be in place, right? So that the standard operating procedures and trainings, things like that. Like you can pass a GMP audit if you aren't perfect, But if you don't have standard operating procedures in place that are not only, written and in place, but also written specifically for your facility and specifically to the standard, the accredited certifying body that you're using. So you have to use the language because everybody's GMP is just a little different, right? And the language is different. So I think people think that they can, go on. I know I'm like, thank you, Darwin, for backing me up. We work with Darwin's company all the time. So, but it happens all the time where people download standard operating procedures, not fill them out correctly, and then fail their audit because they don't understand that it has to be written in a very specific way. And so those are the two things. If you know that and you can do that or hire someone to do it for you, then you're going to be fine. And then implementing things correctly is always good too. But, our goal in my company is to teach the people who are doing compliance, like having a compliance person in your facility and having them trained to the point that they understand how to update those standard operating procedures. They know how to, do all the things that you have to do for GMP, and, making sure that they keep that education up is key. And if you have a company that
I think
can
it all
do those three
starts.
things, you're good.
Yeah. I mean, it all starts there, right? You have to have your business playbook and the SOPs. And even in Colorado, I think they changed the definition to get really specific on what an SOP format needs to look like. Because, I mean, we've all probably seen the good, bad, and the ugly, but I remember, cultivators with handwritten 7 pages of SOP notes on a notebook pad. And you're like, that's not going to qualify. Or it sits on a shelf and it's not utilized.
Oh
So one of the
yeah.
biggest ways to manage your compliance instead of it managing you is to make sure that those are living, breathing documents and that they're updated regularly. You do need an SOP for updating your SOP.
Yeah.
That's a thing.
And I remember when I was a regulator going into these cultivation facilities and they were like, oh, here's the binder. And I'd open it and it'd be covered in dirt and dripping, all
Sure.
of the words all messed up. I'm like, when were the last time you updated these or read these or, and it was just really, I think that people just write them poorly usually
Yeah.
and then just throw them on a shelf and think, hey, we have it. So that's all that matters. And it's not when an accredited certifying body, especially when they come in, or the FDA or OSHA, they actually read your standard operating procedure.
Yeah.
And if what is happening in that procedure is not what's happening in your facility, that's a violation.
And
So
it's
it's
also
not
a
just
product.
having it, it's
Yeah.
actually following it. And I
It's
think
a
that a lot
huge
of people don't
product
understand.
liability issue too, right? It's your first line of defense. If you were to have a recall or someone gets sick from your product, if those SOPs aren't up to speed, you're going to be held liable for not following them and essentially, causing public harm, which is a huge issue.
Yeah, as David said, it
Yeah.
isn't a fact, or maybe it was Darwin, sorry. It's not a fact of if you're going to have a recall, it's when. Every wholesale food manufacturing has recalls. It's how you handle it that matters, right? So if you have a recall and you have nothing in place and you have no idea and you just do whatever the government tells you to do, it's not going to work out as well in your favor. Whereas if you have procedures in place that not only prevent recalls from happening in the first place, right? Which you could catch it before it goes out the door if you have
Ideally.
GMP in place. But not only that, what do you do afterwards? And you are in line and it's a voluntary recall and you look like the superhero company that's we are trying to protect our consumers because they're so important to us. And this is how we're doing it. That looks amazing, right?
Yeah.
So you can take a bad situation and make it look good if you have the proper GMP in place.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's, again, that proactivity, right? We focus more on state stuff, but just having a methodology in place where those compliant processes, people are trained and you have compliant people, and you sort of proactively measure and manage that compliance can be really helpful to making sure you're not behind the eight ball and dealing with all of these horror stories that we see on a regular basis. And I definitely think even though compliance is expensive, the cost of non-compliance can be so much more. A lot more. So, David, from that perspective, we have a lot of changing rules and regulations. Hard to stay on top of this stuff. Maybe not as much with the GMP stuff, but I think certainly at the state level, right? You have almost every single year things changing. So how do you see compliance overall, the way it's being looked at, state to state across the nation, playing a role in the growth of the industry or hindering the growth of the industry? Is there a point where the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? And stay on the illicit market maybe makes more sense than it would be to try to play a game that's almost seeming, rigged to fail.
Oh man, you bring up an interesting point, because everybody knows, I'm sure here in the room, the elephant in the room around, hemp products, right? And the hemp marketplace that is ultimately in many jurisdictions looks identical to a state regulated cannabis product in terms of what can be on the shelves. And they don't have 280E issues to contend with in terms of, tax costs. And so the parity around regulations and tax parity just doesn't exist in those marketplaces, and so it creates this illusion of a lucrative opportunity to jump into, but that's ultimately short-sighted, incredibly short-sighted, because it's not going to last. It's just like, if you're here to make a quick buck, go for it. You're probably not on this call though, because you probably don't care about doing it the right way long term. In 2012, it was a different story. 2011, 2012, 2014, when adult use came, to fruition in Colorado, it was a different marketplace. That was a quick rise. Margins were much different. The industry was fresh. Now it's a mature marketplace. Margins are squeezed. You can't just throw some seeds into the ground or a clone on the ground and be like, we're going to just grow some weed and sell it. Like, what's your differentiator? How are you going to be consistent? And so, the way I look at it is, how are you running your business for driving continuous improvement? I think Kim really said it well in terms of like how your SOPs are managed and how you write them and what you're doing and how you tie back, from my lens, like the KPIs. So, the key performance indicators. So from a compliance standpoint, it's not about, and the changing regulations, it's not about, are we going to catch 100% of this? No, there's no perfect. There is no perfect. Is striving for continuous improvement. Everything in life is subject to change, right? And you either grow or you die. And so by having a good quality system in place with things like, hey, let's have an internal audit program. That's a basic for GMP. Every 1 year at a minimum, review all your SOPs. And that doesn't mean have your compliance person go into the corner, 2 weeks into the corner and just read through 500 pages and tell us what works and what doesn't. Sit down with the cultivation technician, sit down with the IPM person. Those documents should be living, breathing documents and need to reflect the reality. If they don't match with one, the regulations and any changes there, and two, what you're actually doing on the floor, they're useless. They're just confusing for your staff and going to drive inconsistency in your operation, which increases your risk. So use that internal audit program and break it up into quarters. We help folks do it quarterly or monthly. Take one chunk of your business unit and review it at a regular cadence and make sure that you're staying abreast of not just the changing regulatory requirements, but also what industry best practices are. There's so much more knowledge coming out every day. Darwin, me, Kim, Mark, we all go to these conferences fairly often, and there's so much new information coming out. The level of research, even in peer-reviewed, journals, is far exceeding what it ever has in the past for cannabis. Those are opportunities to incorporate into your business as well, into your processes to drive improvement. So think beyond just minimum compliance. If you've got a good system in place, yeah, there's going to be nuances, and that's where, I think Mark, companies like yours and Amber come into play, really valuable to stay on top of the changing regulations, because it can be overwhelming, but ultimately have a foundational system in place so that you can incorporate compliance changes and regulatory changes and be at the forefront of innovation. Because again, think of any consumer product, whether it's a car, a truck, or a house, the technology that went into them 30 years ago versus today, completely different. You don't want to buy a 1990, vehicle. You don't have the technology, the ABS brakes, the airbags, etc. Same with the cannabis industry. We're going through rapid innovation, and we need to keep up with it to be competitive as an industry.
It's a great point. Amber, to that point, where's the balance? You're right. How does the industry find and strike a balance between adhering to strict regulations, affording to do so, and not stifling, right? The innovation and growth that is still so potential in the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think, hopefully before even thinking about, really applying for a license or getting into this space, you're talking with financial professionals, economists who can really help you understand the market that you're about to get into. Some markets just aren't viable right now. And, David mentioned what's happening in hemp and Hemp is allowed to participate in interstate commerce currently. Many states have regulated these products, and you're seeing edibles, beverages, even flour, pre-rolls on the market. That federal law brought access to cannabis to people who didn't have it. We didn't feel the impact here in Colorado and other regulated cannabis states as much because we had cannabis already. But in 2023, I went to Tennessee and there's dispensaries all over the place, and like that, it purely what they have no regulated cannabis program. It purely was hemp. Everyone knew, what was going on. But this is a legitimate impact on our industry, and you have operators saying, hey, we're suffering all of these compliance burdens and costs while this industry is sort of taken off and doing whatever. On the flip side, though, you have economists still saying, well, hemp's not going to impact your business at all. So which one is it? And I think it's really important for people to be able to trust the financial professionals that they're working with, the legal professionals, whatever consultants it might be, so that they can really, trust that they're getting good advice. Of course, you might not always be able to do that, and now you're in this situation already, and you're struggling financially, and it can be challenging for sure. I've worked with plenty of small operators who have had to close their doors. I think many of them take the approach that they're going to try to make it work under the system that they're given. They need to dedicate their time to operations and taking care of their families. They don't have time to be at the Capitol, which can be challenging, I think, because there are always these changes coming down the line. There's another bill in the Colorado legislature right now to make more compliance changes. And unless you're kind of staying on top of that, you're going to miss the boat. But really thinking about, and someone asked me this the other day, and I don't have the answer, maybe folks here do, but in a world where THC beverages are available on the shelves of Total Wines, where does that leave the dispensary? And I recognize that there's a lot in flux with hemp right now, but I'm pretty confident to say that hemp beverages aren't going anywhere. Like, these THC drinks are here and they're here to stay. And so what does that mean for a dispensary? And what if other products are here to stay? And we're now looking at a world where a segment of the market can purchase these products elsewhere. I do believe in my heart that they're different consumers. I think, you have the mom in the grocery store and she doesn't want to drink a bottle of wine that night and she picks up some THC drinks and she would probably never go to a dispensary. There's different potency, market entrance points too, but it's really, really important to think about this stuff. Once you're in it, if you can try and keep your head down and just focus on your business and your relationships, I've seen people find success in that. Really making sure that you're trusting the professionals that you work with to give you sound advice on where to head next. And then, of course, utilizing the courts to your advantage if you have a legal claim to help defend your business.
Yeah, Darwin, you something to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Amber was saying is absolutely great advice. And I think something we've discussed maybe, Mark, is an idea I think we could help licensed operators who are trying to be good actors and are, right, remain so. And I've kind of politely started calling that the Reward the Good Actors Act. And it's kind of just like a real simple framework. We've talked about like that there's increasing compliance requirements, right? In Colorado, you got to adhere to OSHA now. It's like that probably should have been there from the beginning, but it now, it's being added, right? So let's help licensed operators get there by maybe having the state subsidize it. Right? Helping on the front end, right? And potentially there's an opportunity to also help on the back end. So once you've put it in place, maybe you get a tax break or something like that, right? And so that's potentially a way we could help our industry survive and is maybe something that's needed, right? Because as Amber was mentioning, these hemp beverages are definitely here to stay. And how do we get to a regulatory parity and market access parity, right? Maybe helping those licensed operators and on both sides of that coin who want to be good actors and remain so to be so through a subsidized and maybe tax incentives program is an option.
Well, it's an interesting point because, we're the program administrators for Denver's Economic Development Office and their Social Equity Technical Assistance Program. And I can tell you these more marginalized communities are definitely utilizing what resources they can when it comes to compliance management. I think the Cannabis Business Office in Colorado ran out of funding for compliance services under their Access to Experts program for things like SOPs and audits. So I definitely think there's a demand out there that people want and need these types of services and need these components sort of built into their business. And you can't really know where to work on your compliance until you audit your facility and understand where you're lacking in compliance and where your biggest risks are. So I think to that degree, right, there's maybe some sort of precedence in terms of social equity programs to kind of help folks out. And I think from a small business standpoint, right, if we had access to lending, we had access to loans, people could afford some of these retrofits and afford to get their businesses, more efficient and more effective. Still people out there hand watering their plants. I mean, that's because they haven't had the chance to put in a dosatron system yet, or to put in automated watering, right, which would save them a lot in terms of labor and help better manage the consistency of their quality of their product. So I guess one of my questions, might be for any of you that really want to answer it, but how do some of these social equity businesses and some of these smaller businesses, right, that are maybe struggling to get ahead of these compliance hurdles, and often I think lack the financial resources that the traditional larger players might have, what can they do to get more support? Or what can they do to reduce their compliance overhead or their compliance burdens while, without sacrificing their risk?
Yeah, I'd love to jump on that. I think Colorado has done a pretty good job with its social equity program compared to others that we've seen. And, outside of Denver, that program is really focused on providing funding and technical resources to social equity businesses, which I think is really, where, the state can be helpful in that regard. When we tie social equity to licensing, it often gets tricky and it results in bad faith predatory practices that take advantage of people, honestly, leaving them, worse off in many cases than when they started. So, keeping that funding coming, keeping that technical assistance coming. But also, I think, it applies to, a lot right now, but plugging into that local community, networking with one another, connecting with one another, sharing resources to the extent that you can, identifying common issues that as a group you can bring to lawmakers and regulators and say, hey, all of us are really experiencing some negative impacts from this requirement. Can we talk about it? Lobbyists are very expensive, but every single one of these huge companies has a lobbyist at the Capitol advocating for their interests. And if you are not a part of that process, someone else is drafting and writing laws that impact your business on pretty much a daily basis. So it's really, really important that the community pulls together and has a presence during that process. And that's not the easiest thing to do when you're keeping your head down and focusing on your business and keeping food on the table. But to the extent we're forward looking, and we always should be, but it's challenging in this space because it's always changing so quickly. We want to be staying on top of changes like that and advocating for our interests and making sure that the decision makers are hearing the stories of the people who are on the ground trying to run these businesses. I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to a lawmaker and they're like, oh, we talked to those people. And I'm like, no, you didn't. Not really, like there was one of them maybe, but there's a whole group of them that, don't have the time to drive to the Capitol. They don't have the time to send emails and phone calls every day to make sure their issues are heard. So it's definitely not an easy fix. And I don't know that I have all of the answers for sure, but really plugging in with one another, helping out your fellow colleagues where you can, and sharing those resources and insights to help each other.
Yeah, there's definitely some power in the collective. David, what would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts. This is something that when I was the chair of the facility design committee at NCIA, we did this. I thought it was great. Got a lot of great feedback with an Ask the Experts, essentially kind of program where
Yeah.
through the social equity initiative that NCI had, it'd bring in, a new applicant that was in a various stage of, facility design and was stuck, whether, oh, my architect left, I can't get the, drop the ball, I can't get permitting, my engineer said this one thing, and then, city code, said we were in violation, and well, I don't know what the truth is. And we really helped a lot of folks out there. And, the reality is it's really challenging. And let's take a step back and, think about just the reality of any business, right? What is it? I think stats are typically that 80 to 90% of businesses, any business, fails within the first 5 years. And that's
Sure.
just a normal business that needs to have a Secretary of State registration on file and pays your taxes. None of the security, none of the changing regulations. So the barrier is, you know, exponentially higher. So let's be realistic. And I think whether you're a social equity applicant or anybody looking to get into the cannabis industry, think really hard and be open to hearing something that might rub you the wrong way or might be, might challenge what you believe to be true and what's possible. Be open to, somebody that's going to challenge you and really question what you're getting yourself into. And I'm reminded of the former commissioner of, I think, Massachusetts said it really well at a conference I was at. Think about branding. What do you have if you've got $2 million? You can't show up and you shouldn't be showing up and being like, I'm gonna make an edibles line, I'm gonna make vapes, I'm gonna sell flour, pre-rolls, I'm gonna make some cool hash holes that are trending across the West Coast. Like, you can't do it all. What are you really good at? Mark, like, what are you really good at? Are you the best green thumb, or are you an extraction guru? Are you a
Yeah.
solventless rosin like expert, like say Darwin? Don't put Darwin in the room and say, make him the compliance expert. He's a great GMP expert, but like
Sure.
watch him as an engineer. Play to your strengths and build the team with the resources you have and be realistic. Don't
Yeah.
shoot for the moon because again, don't forget that 90% of businesses are doomed to fail in the first 5 years. And I haven't seen any stats, but one stat that really blew my mind last year was over 40% of bankruptcies in the state in Canada um, were were cannabis related
Wow.
businesses.
Do appreciate you guys joining us here today. And certainly, any last thoughts maybe before we leave? Starting with you, Amber.
Oh man, the only one is not a positive note. So I'll just leave it with thank you guys so much. Keep working. You're doing great. Really make sure you find good professionals to help you along the way to give you good advice
You
and
really
and
do get
and
what
you'll
you
get
pay
there.
for, no doubt. Kim.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot like chant this enough, but being proactive rather than reactive is the only way to stay afloat, I think, nowadays, especially with the competition that's out there. See the writing on the wall. What's the next thing that's going to be required? What do we need to be ready for, especially when federal legalization comes?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Darwin.
Yeah, Mark, thank you again so much. This was a really great webinar. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. I would just say, contact us. We were all collaborating to help licensed operators like yourself succeed. We want to see you win. A bunch of us come from industry and our industry as well. And I think providing webinars like this, awareness of these types of topics, and any type of opportunity for training, please reach out to us. We want to make sure that everyone here has the best opportunity to succeed. And of course, live long and process.
And David, bring us home.
All right, I'll put a positive spin. Let's see what I can do here. So, look, be aware of the realities of the barriers, but also look at the amount of resources that are available. For all of you that just attended, you just hopefully learned something new today that you didn't know before. You took the time and you invested in education. There's so many resources. Check out Kim's website, check out mine, the blog posts that are out there. There are, ASTM standards have given you like how to create a recall, an SOP for recalls. There's a great standard on that literally you can use. What will walk you step by step as a guide. Those are like $50, and if you're an ASTM member for $115, you can get all 60 standards included. That's $2 a standard on how to run your business. So, you're not alone. There's so many resources. Reach out to any one of us here. Keep all of our websites, in your back pocket in a folder, and take advantage of those opportunities, and make smart decisions, and you'll continue incrementally to improve and be part of the solution of providing amazing safe products for the marketplace. So I'm optimistic in the future, and I think everybody else should be too, because we're not here because it's easy, right? we're here because it's an opportunity and we believe in the plant and the product. So, and of
Absolutely.
course, I'd be without further ado, Mark. So I really appreciate you putting this together and organizing it. You know, Kim, Amber, it's nice to meet you. Darwin, Kim, always good to see you guys. This has been great.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining and promoting this. And thank you all to our audience for showing up. That's half the battle, right? Showing up to these things, getting the information, and being there for the conversation. So thank you all again, and we appreciate it. Stay tuned for next time, and hopefully we can do something like this again. Have a great rest of your day.
So long.
Thank
See ya.
you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.